And now, like I'm going to be graduating soon here with a degree in healthcare professional services, and I feel I mean I have healthcare background in pharmacy tech, but it's been such a long time, and going back to the healthcare industry, I feel kind of out of place and not exactly sure what I can do with that degree yet, and I'm in the process of learning all that aspect of it. And I thought I would be attending this class just to learn more about it, to like what I can bring to the health industry with what I have.
Gotcha. Yeah, so kind of thinking about like what can you bring, and I think that when I think about imposter phenomenon, like, yeah, it can sometimes it can make it harder for us to really think about like what can I offer, you know, and how do I frame that to potential employers or to anybody really. So I think that hopefully some of the ideas, some of the things in here can address some of that. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking at in the chat box. Somebody said that looking for jobs is sort of uncomfortable, and looking for maybe some tools to combat the feeling. And I think one of the things that I think is really important to say from the outset for this is that looking for jobs is not easy. It's not a fun process. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone be like, yeah, it was just the best ever and we had a great time. And like, that's just not how it works. And I think that not just sort of the imposterism or the imposter syndrome, but also that, like, how do you manage that feeling of discomfort? And one of the things that we're going to talk about, I wanted to kind of split it, and I'll show you kind of my plan for this in a second, but I wanted to split it with starting out with like, what is imposter syndrome, but also kind of give some ideas based on statistics and science for how you might be able to kind of, you know, either reduce that tendency. I think completely eliminating any feeling of discomfort is pretty unlikely, right? I don't think that's the goal. I think the goal is to reduce it, because I think that for a lot of things that produce sort of those feelings of imposterism, like, they are often things that are not super easy or not super comfortable anyway, right? So having a goal of making it completely go away, I think that might be harder to achieve.
As far as like keeping with like the professional image, as far as like being a student right now, and I mean I'm learning a lot about it, and then throughout my time in pharmacy, learning about like trying to stay focused on it. And I've been so out of the loop, and I guess it's a confident question. It's creating that confidence is where I'm lacking.
Totally. And I think that that's definitely connected to what we'll talk about, and hopefully some of the things like that sort of struggle with confidence, I think, is an integral part of what we're talking about with like imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. So let me kind of give y'all an idea of what we're going to talk about in here. You know, I feel like I was trained, you tell people what you're going to tell them, then you tell them what you told them, right? So going to kind of go through this a couple of times. We're going to go through what it is, right? What is the imposter phenomenon? Who does it affect? Then we're going to talk about a little bit related to the job search, right? Areas that you might run into it. And I think we're focusing on imposterism or imposter phenomenon specifically, but I think that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, especially with reducing it, it generalizes, it applies to closely connected ideas, whether that's perfectionism, whether that's self-confidence or self-doubt. A lot of these things are helpful in a lot of these areas. And that's kind of part of why I wanted to talk about the three main ones: shifting perspectives, self-compassion, and then belonging and social support. So just a quick definition of the imposter phenomenon itself. I think a lot of people already kind of have an idea of this, but I find it helpful to, you know, say it out loud. It's when folks are doubting their skills, talents, accomplishments, And there's often this fear of feeling like, oh my gosh, people are going to find out that like, so I'm not supposed to be here, or that they're going to find out how smart I actually am, which it's never ever you're a super genius. It's usually like, oh, I'm not smart enough. Like that's often the fear. And there's often this piece, so looking at the picture on the left, of this assumption that folks around us know a lot more than we know, right? When the reality is often that they, sure, other people know a lot of things. We're not trying to put them down at all. And we often know a lot too. And so when you look at sort of the placing of the circles, the assumption is often that people know that we're a fraud as well. Like they know a lot about us too, when that's not necessarily true either. So some of the characteristics, like we've kind of already talked about: self-doubt, overachieving. So that can be, like over preparing for an exam or a job interview, right? You're like thinking through what's every single question they could ask, and you come up with sort of all of these answers, and that can end up coming off like overly scripted, for example, right? And then it doesn't feel as organic as you might want it to be. I think a lot of it is sort of struggle with realistically assessing competence. We assume that we don't know as much, or we're not as good, or we're not as qualified as we actually are. It can also include sabotaging our own success, right? And I think that's a key piece when we're talking about jobs specifically. That there are lots of ways to inadvertently or on purpose sabotage our own success in a lot of different areas. I also want to point out too, when I think about this, like it's not lost on me that the current job market is probably tougher than it would be at a lot of other times. In recent history, I don't know how recent. The pandemic's been happening for a hot second at this point, but it's harder than it has been in the past. And so I don't want to just sit here and talk about this like, oh, this is all internal and you just have to like not have any imposter syndrome. It is more complex than that, and I want to acknowledge that part too. So some folks are, they like pictures and kind of thinking through things visually. So I wanted to share this with you. This was from one of the empirical articles on imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. And like I said, I'm gonna use those interchangeably as we go through. But this is kind of a helpful way to think about it, how it might sort of show up. I think that the piece that I find really important in here is sort of the accomplishment, feeling of relief, and the sort of discounting of positive feedback. That we will attribute it either to effort, right? So if we like over prepared a lot, spent, hours and hours studying for something or preparing for something, we're just like, oh, that's only because I worked super duper hard, or attributing it to luck, right? If we maybe, because sometimes when we're experiencing imposter syndrome, we'll go to the other end and we'll just kind of put it off, and then like only prep right before something is due or something like that. And by not internalizing that positive feedback, whether that's from the environment, right, like getting a job offer, getting a good grade, having somebody give us positive feedback directly, by discounting that, it kind of leads to this like, yeah, we still don't really believe in ourselves, and then next time we get to the achievement related task, the cycle kind of continues. So I wanted to share a quick TED Talk on what imposter syndrome is and how you can combat it. Because, like I said, some people are visual learners, some are audio learners, some people like a video the most. So give me a second to pull this up. Also, I'll make all of these links available. So, if you want to watch the video again or share it with friends, there's, it's going to be, we'll find a way to get it to you. All right, and let me know if you can't hear it.
Even after writing 11 books and winning several prestigious awards, Maya Angelou couldn't escape the nagging doubt that she hadn't really earned her accomplishments. Albert Einstein experienced something similar. He described himself as an involuntary swindler whose work didn't deserve as much attention as it had received. Accomplishments at the level of Angelou's or Einstein's are rare, but their feeling of fraudulence is extremely common. Why can't so many of us shake feelings that we haven't earned our accomplishments, or that our ideas and skills aren't worthy of others' attention? Psychologist Pauline Rose Clance was the first to study this unwarranted sense of insecurity. In her work as a therapist, she noticed many of her undergraduate patients shared a concern. Though they had high grades, they didn't believe they deserved their spots at the university. Some even believed their acceptance had been an admissions error. While Clance knew these fears were unfounded, she could also remember feeling the exact same way in graduate school. She and her patients experienced something that goes by a number of names: imposter phenomenon, imposter experience, and imposter syndrome. Together with colleague Suzanne Imes, Clance first studied imposterism in female college students and faculty. Their work established pervasive feelings of fraudulence in this group. Since that first study, the same thing has been established across gender, race, age, and a huge range of occupations, though it may be more prevalent and disproportionately affect the experiences of underrepresented or disadvantaged groups. To call it a syndrome is to downplay how universal it is. It's not a disease or an abnormality, and it isn't necessarily tied to depression, anxiety, or self-esteem. Where do these feelings of fraudulence come from? People who are highly skilled or accomplished tend to think others are just as skilled. This can spiral into feelings that they don't deserve accolades and opportunities over other people. And as Angelou and Einstein experienced, there's often no threshold of accomplishment that puts these feelings to rest. Feelings of imposterism aren't restricted to highly skilled individuals either. Everyone is susceptible to a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance, where we each doubt ourselves privately, but believe we're alone in thinking that way because no one else voices their doubts. Since it's tough to really know how hard our peers work, how difficult they find certain tasks, or how much they doubt themselves, there's no easy way to dismiss feelings that we're less capable than the people around us. Intense feelings of imposterism can prevent people from sharing their great ideas or applying for jobs and programs where they'd excel. At least so far, the most surefire way to combat imposter syndrome is to talk about it. Many people suffering from imposter syndrome are afraid that if they ask about their performance, their fears will be confirmed, and even when they receive positive feedback, it often fails to ease feelings of fraudulence. But on the other hand, hearing that an advisor or mentor has experienced feelings of imposterism can help relieve those feelings. The same goes for peers. Even simply finding out there's a term for these feelings can be an incredible relief. Once you're aware of the phenomenon, you can combat your own imposter syndrome by collecting and revisiting positive feedback. One scientist who kept blaming herself for problems in her lab started to document the causes every time something went wrong. Eventually, she realized most of the problems came from equipment failure and came to recognize her own competence. We may never be able to banish these feelings entirely, but we can have open conversations about academic or professional challenges. With increasing awareness of how common these experiences are, perhaps we can feel freer to be frank about our feelings and build confidence in some simple truths. You have talent, you are capable, and you belong. Everyone can use a little extra kick of confidence.
All right. So I'm curious, kind of want to kick it to y'all. What did you find interesting or helpful in the video? Because a lot of what was in there, I'm going to touch on again, but we can kind of highlight stuff that you found interesting or helpful in the way it was talked about, or ideas. It could be anything.
I think for me, this is Camelia. I just really appreciated the use of, you know, important people in life, and how it's something that a lot of people go through, and that it's not something that is wrong with us, but something that that we share and that has commonality between others.
Totally. I love, related to that, I love that they say like it's not a disorder. And that's why, like, you know, in the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual, which is the manual that we use to diagnose mental health disorders, it's not in there. I think in large part because it is so prevalent that it can happen to anyone. It happens to high achievers, and it's not necessarily considered, you know, something that would require mental health treatment. Now, it can be connected to those sorts of things, but that's not necessarily indicative of a severe problem. Also, I will let y'all know, when I switched back in, I can no longer see the chat. So if people are putting things in the chat, someone please let me know.
There are some things in the chat. Let's see. Sarah said, just in general, that this is something that everyone experiences at one point or another, regardless of skill set or perceived success. Sheila said, I found it interesting that it made sure to point out that it's not something that should be downplayed and that it affects people across the board. Andre stated that I had no idea that so many people felt the same way as I do right now. And Debbie stated, I found it interesting that a lot of undergraduate students have the same feelings.
And you know, one of the themes in a lot of those, thanks for sharing those, both to those who typed and thanks for reading it. One of the things that, and I'm gonna go to the next slide because I think it's so relevant here, is that up to 70% of people will have at least one imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon experience in their life. And that is a lot. It's a lot of folks. And I know for me, at least, it was more than I expected, until I went and sort of consulted the research on it. And that's a pretty high number. The other thing that I just kind of wanted to point out, I really think it's important in situations like this. So I'm looking, there are 16 participants in here right now. And I would assume that you're here because either you yourself or somebody close to you has experienced something like this in your life. And so, you know, I think it's helpful to remember that it's not a completely unique or unheard of experience, and that pluralistic ignorance is so, you know, I think of it as like we compare our inside to other people's outside, right? And so we feel what we feel. We know all of, you know, what we're thinking about, what we're feeling. Oftentimes all we see from other people is sort of their external presentation. And people typically want to present themselves fairly well, right? So we may not know what's going on. We may not know their doubts, their struggles, and all of that. And I think that knowing that other people have similar struggles I would encourage y'all to remind yourselves of that. And that's actually a part of self-compassion, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So some other risk factors. I think it's important to note that it happens and can happen to everyone. And also, there are some risk factors associated with experiencing it more. So folks with marginalized identities tend to experience it more, partially because of the way the environment will often send, whether it's microaggressions or whether it's overt messages that maybe you don't belong or you can't do this. And folks with marginalized identities tend to experience that more, which then it would make sense that feeling of like, well, I don't know, am I supposed to be here? Am I enough? Whatever, however you want to frame it, it makes sense. And actually, I'll provide a quick piece of information. So there's this concept known as stereotype threat, which was researched probably like 20 years ago now, maybe even longer. But basically, the gist of it is that when researchers told people with certain marginalized identities that some task was, like a task that, like a STEM task, for example, like this is a math exam, that in some cases, folks with marginalized identities did not do as well as their white counterparts. And then when they basically had the same groups do it again and told them this is just a game, it is not an indicator of intelligence or aptitude or anything like that, they saw those discrepancies decrease. And that the research on that suggests that there is, like, these messages get internalized of, oh, you're not as good at this. I mean, we hear some of these messages, especially around like science, technology, engineering, and math, but I think it can happen everywhere. And so that, that is an important thing to keep in mind as we're talking about this. And as you're thinking about like, oh, might this be happening to me? Why might this be happening? Also, first generation college students. So I wanted to kind of talk through that one in competitive classroom environments. So the first gen part, and then also sort of being in a competitive classroom environment where people may not be talking about like, yeah, this is tough for me. That was a really hard quiz or whatever. And then also folks who grew up in either overly critical or overly praising environments will sometimes either feel like, well, they're just saying that because whatever, or I can never get anything right. And both ends of the spectrum can kind of contribute to that possibility. Finally, folks with a limited sense of belonging, feeling like, oh, I don't belong in this situation, in this office, in this work situation, in this academic setting, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious, I know that we've kind of talked about this a little bit. Some of you have already shared ideas, but think through it either for, just for yourself, but then also, if you got one, share with the group. How might the imposter phenomenon affect job search in your mind? Like
I'm sorry. As far as like with like the discussion board in school, how we all discuss, and then we get feedback from our teachers and professors, and I mean, I for one, I look for the feedback all the time. Is that normal? I mean, as far as like, it's a process of learning. I understand that, but I don't account for everything I do because of the feedback. But it's good to, but it's like something that I do all the time, and I wonder if like with other resources that I'm unable to actually didn't have time to get to and to find out more about it. And, I feel this anxiety, that's normal, right? As far as like with a lot of.
And I think that wanting feedback and wanting to grow from feedback can be helpful. I also think that if that's then sort of getting in the way of like, you get a piece of feedback and then it takes you a really long time to process it because it was really painful, or if, there's sort of a continuous pervasive fear of like, am I missing something? That would be a time when I would say, yeah, like kind of thinking through how do I make sure that this is helping me as opposed to getting in my way. I think that's how I would think about that particular situation. But I think that inherently feedback can be very helpful, right? Because we don't know what we don't know. And so getting that feedback can be beneficial.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's something in the chat.
Yeah.
So Christina said it could limit the jobs you look into. You might ignore really good opportunities because you don't think you would be successful in them, even though you could excel at them.
Great one. That is definitely, well, to me, that's near the top of the list of like, when I kind of at the beginning, when I mentioned sabotaging yourself, I think that's a pretty high on the list. Any other ones?
Chandler said the same. We won't apply for certain jobs because we think we aren't good enough. And Vu said, what about fake it till you make it?
Yeah. Fake it till you make it I think it's a complex concept. I haven't really thought about it, so I don't know how it applies to this particular issue. I know that acknowledging our both our imperfections, our anxieties, like that is an integral part of this. And in that way, we're not faking it. But I like the idea of, and I will talk about when we talk about sort of how to work with it. One of the things that I think can be helpful, how to work with imposter syndrome or imposterism, is to take those small steps and to do it. And I think that piece of like that sort of embedded element of fake it till you make it, the like you just got to do the thing anyway, that part I can get on board with a lot. I think the fake it part, as in like maybe you're ignoring parts of your experience, or you are faking, that part I think is not as helpful as trying to really acknowledge what we are capable of and making an honest assessment of what we can do. And I'll actually get to that more in a second.
There's a couple.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a couple of more. So Sheila said, I remember hearing an anecdote about 2 job listings posted in a paper where the credentials or duties were the same, but the salaries were vastly different, and how more people went for the lower salary than the higher one. And then Alyssa said, similar to what Christina said, I know I personally have not applied for jobs because I feel like, quote, why would they want me? I have no experience with this, end quote. Even though it is something I want to learn about, I hope that made sense what I was trying to say. It does make sense. Yes, Alyssa.
Totally makes lots of sense. And I've talked to colleagues, I've had that experience where they're like, I'm doing all these great professional things in my life, blah, 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 blah. I really need to apply for some jobs because that's actually what I'd like to do. And that is like, that's a hard one. That's a hard one. And I can imagine also kind of building on the example of the sort of story of the lower and the higher salary. I wonder if that's also part of it too, is, not just applying for jobs, but applying for really jobs that are perceived as competitive or prestigious. There's more of a like, oh man, okay, you got to get over the hump for that, right? Because there's more of that possibility of self-doubt and I don't know, can I actually do this? So let's kind of, y'all already kind of hit on a lot of these. So I'm gonna touch on this briefly. Sort of when picking jobs to apply to, I feel like we've talked about that a fair amount. Submitting application materials, right? Sometimes, like if you have to write a cover letter, kind of hedging on things and being like, well, I might be able to do this particular job. Or even if you don't put it that way, you sort of give that vibe, which it's funny, I have made that mistake in job applications in the past. And one of my mentors, when she was reading it, looked at it and was like, hey, you probably want to like strengthen your language from like, I might be able to do this job to I can do this job. Because if you're applying for a job, like you don't want them to think, well, I'm not sure if this person thinks they can do the job. That generally doesn't serve you in an application, right? So not just what jobs to apply for, but also submitting application materials. And then also interviews, right? Over preparing, under preparing. And then kind of, if you get an offer or if you're in that process, negotiating from a place of, I deserve this position, like I can do this position, as opposed to, oh, why did they pick me? I don't know what that was about, right? And I think, again, all of this is a part of the process. And I loved in the video, the goal is not to completely eradicate these thoughts or feelings. It's to notice them, work with them, challenge them when needed, accept them when needed. And we'll talk about that. That's actually kind of what I want to move into, because I think that, what's probably most helpful for y'all after identifying is how do we reduce it? And like I kind of said at the beginning, I'm going to focus it a little bit more on job search, but a lot of this stuff is for life, right? Whether that's, going on a date, whether that's taking a test, whether that's presenting an idea to a coworker, right? It doesn't just have to be job search. So first part, internalizing positives. This is part of shifting perspectives. So I love this little picture on the left. You can read through it. Basically, the person on the right is just assuming that all of the positive feedback they're getting is because people have to say that, right? And that goes back to that infographic picture that I had at the beginning, right? Like we're always discounting that positive feedback. And so I really encourage y'all to celebrate your successes, you know, to try to internalize. And it's funny because I think one thing people often, like when we receive positive feedback, people don't always know what to do with it, right? It can almost feel like awkward at times. They're like, oh, you did such a great job. And you're like, what do I do with this? Sometimes just saying thank you. Because not only does that say, I heard your positive feedback, it also gives you the chance to maybe let it in a little bit, you know, and to not be like, well, I worked really hard, or maybe I just got lucky. Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you liked it, or I'm glad you found it good. I think that's definitely related to assessing capacities honestly, right? If you're here, if you got a degree, you know, I know somebody put in the chat box that they graduated in Denver. In December, started with D, whoops. Graduated, or you're looking for a job now because you're going to graduate. You clearly, you're either close to or you're working towards the degree, you're still here. You've got to have some capacities that are allowing you to do that. We can't, as the university, we can't all possibly be making the same mistake of allowing you to pass classes and to stay here and all of that stuff, right? That is actually attributable to y'all. And so gently challenging some of those unhelpful thoughts, right? If I have some of those, you know, like I can't do this, or I'm never gonna amount to anything. It could be, this is hard, or maybe I am capable. And I like that question at the end. What if you are? And it's whatever words you want to put in there, right? What if I am capable? What if I am competent? What if I am able to do this? What if I am qualified for this job? How would I act? What would I do if I was qualified for this particular job? And I guess I want to share one more piece as I'm thinking about it for like internalizing positives. Sometimes thinking, you know, well, wait, is anyone else, like, why would I assume that anyone else is more qualified for this? You know, and I think about areas where there have been times where I would hesitate to refer to myself as an expert in something in my own field. And then I kind of thought about it and I was like, but if I'm not an expert, then who is? Like, because for example, so my dissertation was on working with gender and masculinities. And it was like, well, if I did an entire dissertation on this topic, you know, wrote a very long paper, and that's took a while, I suppose that might actually mean that I'm capable in this particular area, or could say, yes, maybe I'm close to or at expert level. So that to me is really important, that whole piece of internalizing positives as you can. Another piece in here is watching out for perfectionism, right? Assuming like, oh, I have to be perfect for this job, right? We might look at a job application and be like, oh man, I didn't hit every single thing perfectly. It wasn't like right, like right down the center of what I do or what I'm best at. And that's not necessarily a reason to not apply. Let the potential employer decide. Let them make that decision. Don't make that decision for them. So watching out for that sort of perfectionism, or either I'm definitely good enough or I'm terrible or not good enough. This second point, keep going despite your fears. This to me is related to the fake it till you make it piece, right? That piece of we've got to keep going, that part I really can get on board with, right? Keep going. Yes, if you're stretching, if you're going for it, right? If you're trying to achieve your best, in many cases, there will be some fear. There will be some hesitation, some self-doubt, because that's what it is to challenge ourselves. And so for many people who have that knowing, like that this may this might be uncomfortable, right? This might be difficult. And taking those small steps, which I find is especially helpful for procrastinating. So it could be, oh, I've got a thing I've got to do. I'm going to work on this for 5 minutes. This is a very small step, 5 minutes. That's it. And sometimes just getting started, then 30 minutes later, you're like, oh, I'm still working on this. This is good. Sometimes not, right? And sometimes it's best to do it those 5 minutes and be like, I'm done. I achieved my goal. I really like this quote, right? Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The goal is not to get rid of the fear. The goal is not to completely eradicate the doubt. It's to do our best to continue moving in towards our goals in spite of our fears and in spite of that sense of maybe those doubts, that imposterism. If you have any questions on this, feel free to put them in the chat box, and when I hear them, I'll comment on them or I'll try to answer them.
I have one. As far as like when we go look for jobs, so that how like everything is like entry level. I mean that does anybody else have like a kind of a self-doubt when they hear that? I mean, as far as like people are looking for entry level position, and like a lot of time I feel that I'm more qualified than that, or sometimes I'm like not as qualified as the entry level. Was that something that we have to assess? Like,
Sure, I feel like that's a question for other folks in the group. I'm guessing that some other folks have. I'd love to hear if somebody else is willing to put it in the chat box or to chime in.
I feel like it's kind of like you have to start somewhere, but then also if the employer feels like you're more qualified, then they'll find, and they think you're a good fit for the company or whatever, then they'll find something for your, like, to fit your, what am I trying to say? Like, your qualifications. So it's like, I feel like I had what I wanted to say in my head and now I can't think of it.
No, I think so. I'm gonna see if I can get this. Kind of what you're saying is like, if they like you, they'll find a place for you. Like they'll, and so maybe they might even be like, look, this isn't quite the job for you, but we like what you got. We got this other similar job or slightly different job, and you don't know. You never know. Does that kind of fit what you were getting at?
Yeah. Because I had anxiety with that before, with like reading through qualifications and versus like what I'm and looking at myself and creating my own fear towards it. It was kind of disturbing at the time. But thank you.
Yeah, and then is that what you were getting at, Alyssa?
Yeah, and I even think like even if it's like they find a place for you that's at what you feel like is the very bottom, I feel like you're still gonna learn a lot of things. So there's always like good and bad things to like joining that entry level.
Totally.
Yeah, and I had to get out of the habit of making decisions for people. So I wouldn't apply for positions because I was like, oh, they're not going to like me. So I'm not going to do it. Same as what we've been talking about. But I've really had the chance to kind of take a step back and say, this is what I have to offer. It's either going to fit what they're looking for or it's not. And being okay with them saying it's not a good fit, because they would know what they're looking for and I can only offer them what I'm able to. So really being able to take the ownership of what you're capable of, and celebrate that, but then also know that that's not necessarily the fit for everyone. And it looks like Lauren has her hand raised.
I just wanted to add to that It can also be a learning experience. Like if you want to apply for something above entry level, then you should apply for it. I think you might also gain, like, if you don't get the job, why didn't you get the job and what can you do to get it next time? Or maybe you do get the job and that's even better.
I think
Well,
these
I
are
was
all really, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, you're good. I wanted to also add, so for me, yes, I feel like the feelings of like, oh, they're not gonna like me, have always set me back a little bit. Because now I look at my resume and I say, well, I've sort of stuck in the same areas. I haven't explored somewhere else. And that goes for internships too. So there was one internship that I applied to, and one I was very scared because I was like, I don't feel like I'm ready, but when it's the right time, right? And so I did it anyways. And I mean, I didn't get accepted, but the person was really nice to send me some other info to get similar internships. And I took advantage of that, and I contacted other people and they say, yeah, sure, why not? When you're ready, like come back and just give me all your info and then we'll see from there. And from that, I was able to get other internships because I was like, well, if I don't set my one toe in the water, I will never know how it feels. And and I tried that and I got some internships somewhere else. Not exactly with what I originally planned, but it's still related to my future plans. And so I was glad that I got that in. It scares me to like just leave school and be like, okay, now I have to apply for a big job.
Totally. Awesome. I makes me super happy to hear, and I think that you did what we're talking about in this particular situation. So like, awesome. And yeah, it's never like, it can still be daunting or scary. You know that it is. It will be. That's part of the process.
We have one more hand raised if there's time.
Sure. Yeah, I
Okay.
was gonna say I will. I was gonna save time for questions at the end. But what we can do is, I'd prefer to just kind of have a conversation like this. So yeah, one more. We can do that, and then I'll keep moving.
Sure. Andres?
Yeah, thank you. I was just gonna add that I've never sort of felt this sort of imposter syndrome feeling before until after I graduated from college. I started. I've been working on my resume these last couple of weeks, and filling it out has been kind of hard because I'm always thinking of who I'm gonna send it to or where I'm gonna apply and whether or not I have what it takes to be an office manager or be in charge of inventory or what have you. It is something that I've never sort of experienced before, but having heard that, yeah, you do need to definitely celebrate your achievements, right? You have to give yourself credit for what you have achieved, right? I think it's very important, and I feel a little bit better for sure. But it is a weird feeling. I think it is something that I never thought I'd feel because I've always been very confident in what I can do and my abilities. But yeah, like I'll be just about to fall asleep, and then all of a sudden I'd be thinking, man, well, what if I'm on the job and I can't perform what I said I could do or what's on my resume, right? It's always they're nagging at me now that I have the opportunity to apply for one of these jobs. But yeah, I think definitely I see what I'm capable of, and I think I'm still gonna feel a little bit of it here and there, right? I don't know if it'll ever truly go away, but I feel more confident knowing that um, yeah, you sort of have to give yourself credit, right? You have to be kind to yourself, I think is another key point to it. But yeah, I just felt like I wanted to share. Uh, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Andres. And I love so many of the things you said in there. You know, the giving credit. I think the other piece is, you know, when I say 70% of folks experience the imposter syndrome experience, it's can be specific to certain things. Like some folks won't have it in one area, but they will in others, right? And so it you know it you could go for a while. You could go, like, people are like, yeah, I'm really good at school. But then when it's like, oh man, I got to sell myself on the job market, that's when it starts to come in more, or vice versa, right? The other thing you said, and I kind of want to go to this because it's so key, is that kindness. Um, we got to be kind to ourselves. And so I want to briefly go through self-compassion. I'm going to have some resources at the end. If you like what you hear in here, you can do it more. I'm going to keep this brief just in the interest of time so that we don't go over. But basically, I think of it as self-compassion in a nutshell is when you're having a rough time. So many of us, I think of it, and I talk about this in my clinical work with folks. Are you kicking yourself when you're down? Are you, because you're already hurting, you're already not feeling great, and here you are kind of being like, why can't I do this? I'm not doing it right. And really, to me, self-compassion is being an inner ally rather than an inner critic or an inner enemy. And so there's three pieces to it. And one of them is being that self-kindness, right? Being understanding towards ourselves when we're suffering, feeling inadequate, when we feel like this is really daunting, right? Being nice to ourselves, which is really easy to say in my experience, and a good deal harder to do at times. It's a practice, and that's the other thing. I think of a lot of these are skills that you're building, whether it's internalizing that positive feedback. Like, it's not just gonna be like, boom, now we're doing it, right? You're gonna practice it, and inevitably, it's not gonna go as well as you'd like to some of the time. Might take some time and some consistent kind of engagement. Same thing with this. The second one there, common humanity, right? That piece I really want to kind of, and I love when y'all are sharing these experiences, because it really does promote that sense of common humanity, right? Suffering, personal inadequacy, those feelings, they are part of our experience. So when you're in those moments, instead of kicking ourselves and saying, I'm not doing it right, something's wrong with me, saying like, this is a moment of suffering. Lots of people experience this, lots of people who are searching for jobs or experiencing some difficult loss or whatever it may be, experience struggle. And that we are social creatures. So sometimes just remembering that this is happening in the social context can be very helpful. And then finally, mindfulness, which is really, it's the ability to kind of notice what we're thinking or feeling without jumping to a conclusion. It kind of allows us to give the presence of mind. That's also a practice. And I would say if you're interested in that one, there's so much information on the internet. It's become a very big thing. So I'm not going to talk about it anymore here, because I think there are so many opportunities to practice that, from YouTube videos to podcasts, everything. And this is, so I was going to have you look through this a little bit more, but this is just a sample of some questions that are on a questionnaire. You can actually rate your self-compassion. It's on a website. That'll be, it's in a link that is at the end, and I'll make sure that there's a way to get you all these slides, like I said. So I've already kind of touched on a lot of these, responding to that inner critical voice with kindness, right? And I love to think about it as, how would someone who really cares about me, what would they say right now? Am I saying what they would be saying? And can I practice saying what they would be saying? That, and it could be a parent, it could be a sibling, it could be a very close friend, it could be a mentor, but someone who really cares about you. Seeing those difficult experiences as painful rather than personal failures. There's some exercises you can do that involve self-soothing and sort of supportive touch, right? And I think about that, we can kind of provide that for ourselves. But then also, so like, it can be almost like, you know, just like noticing when we're kind of holding our hands, and or even like, you know, give yourself a hug and just kind of notice that. And then gratitude. Being grateful for what we have, for our abilities, is also a way of internalizing the positive. So a couple final thoughts. This was in the video. Sharing your concerns with somebody you trust can really help. And, you know, it can be, like the video said, it can be a variety of different folks, mentor, friend, family member. One I want to point out here, limiting social comparison and competition, right? I would say take what you see on social media with a grain of salt. Sometimes it's a great way to stay connected to folks. And also, if all you're seeing is people at their best, it can do that thing where you're comparing your internal experience to the best they have to offer on social media. Final thoughts on this, kind of building a community, part of putting yourself out there. Obviously that can be harder during the pandemic. I kind of commented on that earlier. And then having compassion. We all have moments of loneliness or feeling like we don't belong. You are not alone in that. That is a nearly universal human condition. So having that self-compassion, that common humanity for that. So I'm gonna, because of the time, I wanna run through the last things. I'm gonna leave this as sort of a final thought for y'all. My hope is that you will take one idea, one thing, whether it was a practical piece of like how you can shift it, or a, you know, something you learned about what it is, and you can apply that to your life. That's my hope. So these resources, I'm not going to go through them. I'll make sure that they're available to you somehow. I'm sure there's a way we can make it happen. This is the self-assessment that you can do. I showed you the questions for that. And then here's a little bit about our services, right? For many people, this is not a major issue such that they would need to seek counseling. But in some cases, it can produce a lot of anxiety, depressive symptoms. So here's some of our information. And then we've also got more of these. This isn't the only one that we're offering. So I'm gonna go back to this one, let y'all do that. I can hang around for a few more minutes. But like I said, my hope is that you take something from this and apply it. That it's not just a thing that we talked about for an hour and that was great, but that really as you're going and searching for jobs, you make a plan, you add a piece. And you're welcome to share it in the chat box right now if you'd like. Like I said, I'll be around for a few more questions. But my last thought is, for those of you who are here, thank you for coming and thanks for sharing. Felt like we had a bit of a conversation and that was really cool.
Thank you so much, John. We appreciate you taking your time to present this information. And yes, we can get you this information if you don't mind just emailing it to me, and then I can email it to everybody who registered for this event. So we'll make sure to get you this information. This recording will also be available on our YouTube. So if you want to rewatch it, feel free. We'll have that probably uploaded in the next couple of hours. So yeah, I'll include the link in that too with the resources. Any final questions or thoughts? Great. Thank you all. I appreciate you being here. Please, I put in the chat, know that we do have resources on campus to help practice your interview skills, to go over your resume. Contact the C2 Hub and we'll be able to set you up with an appointment to be able to do those things, because practice will help to kind of eliminate some of those fears. So thank you all. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for the positive feedback.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good one.